You've been told that the 19th century was an age of steam, coal, and humanity's first clumsy steps toward an industrial society. In this version of history, soot-covered workers with pickaxes and shovels create masterpieces that are incredibly difficult to replicate even today with our lasers and computer modeling. But the official story omits one detail that shatters the entire picture: the metal. Where did so much metal come from in an era when the primary mode of transport was a horse and cart? The crowning jewels of this technological absurdity were the Crystal Palace in London and the Eiffel Tower in Paris. Historians calmly assert that these behemoths were designed on paper by candlelight, then cast and assembled by hand by semi-literate workers in record time. But the moment you pick up a calculator and a metallurgy textbook, the official story begins to fall apart at the seams, revealing a terrifying void. Our investigation begins with the marvel of the Victorian era, the Crystal Palace in London, supposedly built in 1851. This gigantic structure of glass and cast iron was erected in just a few months. The exhibition hall covered over 90,000 square meters, with a length of 564 meters. And all of this, according to textbooks, was designed by a gardener, Joseph Paxton, a man who had only built greenhouses before. Suddenly, he creates a design requiring engineering calculations on par with modern materials science. But the most incredible part lies in the materials. Construction required 4,500 tons of cast iron and iron structures, not to mention 300,000 panes of hand-blown glass. 4,500 tons of metal. In the mid-19th century, metallurgy, as we are told, was just getting started. To produce such a quantity of pure, high-quality cast iron for load-bearing structures, tens of thousands of tons of ore had to be processed, and mountains of coal had to be burned. Where were these giant mines? Where were the foundries capable of producing materials of such quality at such a pace? Judging by the iron production statistics of the time, the entire industry of Britain would have had to work exclusively on this palace, halting the production of rails, machinery, and weapons. Now let's jump to France in 1889, to the symbol of Paris, the Eiffel Tower. It was built in 2 years, 2 months, and 5 days. The weight of the metal structure is 7,300 tons. 7,000 tons of special puddled iron. Puddling is a process where molten cast iron is manually stirred in a furnace with long rods to burn off excess carbon. It's hellish, backbreaking, and incredibly inefficient labor. With this method, it's impossible to achieve material uniformity. Each batch of metal would differ in composition and strength. But the tower stands, perfectly assembled from 18,000 parts. To produce 7,000 tons of such iron, entire armies of workers would have been needed, stirring molten metal with rods day and night. And again, an economic question arises. In the late 19th century, France was going through hard times after wars and crises, and suddenly, the state spends a colossal amount of funds and a strategic resource, high-quality iron, on what was essentially a useless exhibition arch. Where is the logic in this? This looks less like a demonstration of power, and more like the use of a pre-existing resource that came at no cost. We are faced with a fundamental contradiction. The official figures and dates do not align with the laws of physics and economics. It was impossible to produce such volumes of metal with the stated technologies. But even if we assume they somehow produced all this metal, the next step is where the story enters the realm of pure fantasy. It had to be delivered. Even if we were to concede that the metal for these grand projects was miraculously produced, it then had to be transported to construction sites located in the centers of Europe's largest capitals. And it's here that the official version of history collides with the laws of elementary logistics. In the mid-19th century, railways had extremely limited capacity and did not form a comprehensive network. The primary means of freight transport remained the horse-drawn cart. Now, picture this. Thousands upon thousands of carts, pulled by exhausted horses, hauling multi-ton cast iron beams and intricate trusses over rutted, muddy roads in England and France. Each such cart is a slow-moving obstacle, creating traffic jams for miles. The delivery of 4,500 tons of materials for the Crystal Palace to Hyde Park should have triggered a transportation collapse that would have paralyzed London for months, if not a year. The same applies to Paris during the construction of the Eiffel Tower. The city center should have turned into an impassable labyrinth of building materials, carts, and animals. This would have been front-page news in every paper, the main topic of conversation among citizens, and city authorities would have left records of their attempts to solve this monstrous problem. But in the archives of the time, there is a deafening silence. No mention of a traffic apocalypse, no complaints. Both gigantic structures rose in the hearts of their cities as if their parts had materialized on site out of thin air, like mushrooms after the rain. But the logistical nightmare is only half the problem. The true technological miracle, bordering on science fiction, begins at the moment of assembly. The Eiffel Tower consists of 18,038 metal parts, held together by 2.5 million rivets. Each rivet had to be heated red hot, inserted into a hole, and hammered from both sides by a team of men before it cooled and contracted, pulling the structure tight. All of this at a tremendous height, in the wind, where the slightest mistake could be fatal. The official story states that all the holes for these millions of rivets were drilled in advance at different factories. Eiffel's engineers, using only slide rules and paper blueprints, supposedly calculated all 18,000 unique parts with pinpoint accuracy, down to a fraction of a millimeter, and never once made a mistake. This is statistically impossible. In those days, a unified system of standards was just beginning to emerge. Each factory, each workshop, had its own templates, its own inches, and its own feet. To believe that thousands of workers in different parts of the country, using different tools, created millions of parts that fit together perfectly during assembly is to believe in a fairy tale. Even today, with computer modeling, laser guidance, and CNC machines, major construction projects constantly face problems with components not fitting. Under the alleged conditions, the assembly of the Eiffel Tower should have turned into an endless nightmare of filing, hammering, and constant on-site adjustments. But it is perfect. Its lines are flawless. This points to only one conclusion. All the parts were manufactured at a single, highly advanced production complex that operated under incredibly strict standards. A complex that simply does not exist in the official history of the 19th century. The same story applies to the Crystal Palace, with its elegant artistic castings and thousands of standardized, perfectly matched components. Such precision and quality seem impossible. But what's even stranger is what happened to one of these eternal structures. In 1936, the Crystal Palace burned down. A building of iron and glass burned to the ground like a matchbox. Cast iron doesn't burn. Glass melts at enormous temperatures, comparable to those in an industrial furnace. To destroy such a colossus, it would take more than an accidental fire. How? The night of November 30th, 1936, marked the end of an era. A massive glow over London could be seen for dozens of miles. The Crystal Palace was on fire, the pride of Victorian England, a structure that had captivated the imaginations of engineers and architects for nearly a century. According to the official version, it all started with a small fire in an office, which, due to strong winds, rapidly engulfed the entire gigantic building. The fire raged with such an unholy fury that thousands of tons of cast iron and iron didn't just melt, but literally flowed in molten rivers, while the glass vaults shattered with a deafening roar, showering the ground in a rain of molten mass. By morning, all that remained of the symbol of technological progress was a twisted, smoking skeleton. But there is one fundamental problem with this tragic story that troubles researchers who disagree with the standard version of events. This problem lies in the realm of basic physics. Cast iron, the primary building material of the palace, is not a flammable material. Its melting point is around 1200 degrees Celsius. To bring 4,500 tons of metal, distributed over a vast area, to such a state requires not just a fire, but a giant blast furnace. A conventional fire, caused by burning wooden floors or exhibition displays, cannot generate and sustain such a monstrous temperature throughout the entire volume of the building. It would have damaged sections, caused parts of the structure to collapse, but it could not have completely incinerated the entire metal behemoth. The same applies to the glass. For 90,000 square meters of glass not just to crack from the heat, but to melt into a liquid state, a temperature of over 1,400 degrees is required. Witnesses describe not just a fire, but a veritable firestorm, inexplicable in terms of the chemistry of combustion. A structure made of essentially non-combustible materials vanished as if it were built from dry straw. And this suggests that the official cause is merely a convenient cover story. For the first time, a suggestion is voiced that reclassifies this story from an accident to a conspiracy. This was not an accidental fire. This was a meticulously planned and flawlessly executed operation of destruction. Complete, total destruction, leaving no chance for restoration or, more importantly, for investigation. When the flames died down, there was nothing left to investigate, only a heap of melted metal and shattered glass where it was impossible to conduct a materials analysis, to study their composition or manufacturing technology. The main question arises: what evidence needed to be so urgently and radically erased from the face of the earth? What secrets did this delicate palace hide in its construction? Perhaps the answer lies in the material itself. What if a chemical analysis of the 1851 cast iron beams, conducted with 20th or 21st century technology, revealed a composition or casting method absolutely impossible for that era? What if alloying additives or a metal structure were discovered, indicating a far more advanced metallurgy? Fire is the perfect tool for concealing such secrets. It erases everything, turning evidence into shapeless slag. The Crystal Palace was not just a building. It was an artifact, physical proof of the existence of technologies that do not fit into the official timeline of progress. And its elimination was necessary to preserve the integrity of the version of history we are taught. But if the Crystal Palace had to be destroyed to hide something, perhaps other similar achievements of that time were not what they seemed either. This pattern, grandiose construction followed by complete disappearance, was repeated again and again. And the perfect stage for this spectacle was the so-called World's Fairs. The mysterious disappearance of the Crystal Palace was not an isolated incident, but merely the first act in a spectacle of unprecedented scale that played out across the globe in the second half of the 19th and early 20th centuries. The stage for this drama was the World's Fairs in Paris, Chicago, St. Louis, Philadelphia. The script was always strikingly similar. In an impossibly short time, usually a year or two, a giant dream city would rise from the ground, composed of majestic palaces, pavilions, and monuments in a classical or neoclassical style. These complexes were staggering in their scope, architectural complexity, and, most importantly, their technological innovations, such as widespread electric lighting and even moving sidewalks. The most striking example is the 1893 World's Columbian Exposition in Chicago, the so-called White City. On an area of several hundred hectares, an ensemble was erected that rivaled ancient Rome in its grandeur. Shining white colonnades, gigantic domes, canals with gondolas, and thousands of electric lights that turned night into day. The official history assures us that all this splendor was merely a temporary set, built from cheap materials. a wooden frame covered with a mixture of plaster and hemp fiber. A temporary pavilion to showcase achievements. But this is hard to believe. And here is the key moment. After a few months of operation, the fair would close. And almost immediately, these grand complexes met the same fate. They were either demolished with inexplicable haste or accidentally burned to the ground in a series of strange, devastating fires. A very convenient way to get rid of temporary buildings, isn't it? Fire erases everything. However, when the smoke cleared and demolition crews arrived, the illusion of temporary sets shattered. Beneath the charred plaster facade, a picture emerged that completely contradicted the official version. Powerful steel frames were visible, similar to those used in the construction of the first skyscrapers. Solid brick walls emerged, testifying to the durability and strength of the construction. Workers stumbled upon deep foundations extending far underground, capable of supporting not a cardboard model, but a full-fledged stone building several stories high. Why build permanent structures designed to last for centuries, only to use them for one season and then destroy them? It is an economic madness that has no rational explanation. This consistent pattern, rapid creation and even more rapid destruction, leads to a frightening and radical hypothesis. What if the organizers of these fairs weren't builders? What if they were, in fact, liquidators? Imagine a scenario. Authorities discover a city or industrial complex that survived some global catastrophe, partially buried under the earth. These ancient structures are fenced off. A quick restoration is carried out. The buildings are cleaned, given a grand appearance, and utilities are connected. Then a sign is hung. The World's Fair of the Achievements of Industry. And the public from all over the world is invited to admire the newly built wonders. It was a grand cover-up operation. They weren't showcasing their own achievements to the world, but the heritage of a far more advanced, previous civilization, passing it off as their own. And after the fair had served its purpose, the evidence, the buildings themselves, was methodically destroyed, demolished or burned, so that no one could conduct an independent analysis of the materials and technologies. It wasn't just buildings being destroyed, it was technology. Technologies that could have given humanity a completely different path of development. Let's talk about the true purpose of this iron lacework. The destruction of these magnificent structures was not merely an act of vandalism or economic necessity. It was a targeted erasure of evidence, a wiping from the face of the earth not just of buildings, but of the very principles upon which they were founded. To understand the motive behind this global crime, we must stop looking at the Eiffel Tower, the Crystal Palace, and the World's Fair pavilions through the eyes of a tourist or an architect. We need to see them through the eyes of an energy engineer. And then, behind the delicate iron lacework and elegant forms, their true, purely technical purpose emerges. These are not entrance arches or exhibition halls. These are giant components of a highly complex technical system, parts of a single machine. All this architecture of iron, copper, and stone was part of a global network for extracting, converting, and transmitting atmospheric electricity, or, as it was formerly known, the ether. This was a technology based on entirely different physical principles than our primitive system of burning resources. Ancient civilizations, it seems, knew how to harness the energy that is literally all around us. Look at the structure of the Eiffel Tower. It is not just a tower. It is a perfect antenna. Its spire is a classic ionizer and discharger, designed to interact with the upper layers of the atmosphere. Its entire metal structure is a giant waveguide, a resonator tuned to a specific frequency. And its true foundations, extending deep underground and hidden from our view, served as a powerful grounding circuit, creating a potential difference between the Earth and the atmosphere. The metal used in these structures also possessed special properties, perhaps high conductivity and a capacity for resonance, which we are only now beginning to rediscover. This was not a standalone installation. The domes and spires of old cathedrals, train stations, and government buildings around the world. These were all elements of a single energy grid. They collected energy from the atmosphere and likely transmitted it wirelessly for lighting, heating, and powering mechanisms unknown to us. Free, clean, inexhaustible energy, available to everyone, anywhere on the planet. And those who seized power in the world after the 19th century global catastrophe understood perfectly what they were dealing with. They found a functioning or easily repairable energy infrastructure capable of turning human life into a paradise. But they didn't want paradise. They wanted power. And power is built on the control of resources. Free energy makes people free and independent. But energy that must be mined, transported, and sold, coal, oil, gas, makes people slaves, tied to a system. This is precisely why, at the end of the 19th century, we observe a strange and illogical paradox. Alongside these standing and possibly still functioning etheric power stations, we are aggressively pushed toward primitive, dirty, and inefficient technologies. Internal combustion engines and steam engines, fueled by burning fossil fuels. This was the greatest act of sabotage in human history. To make us pay for light and heat, the old infrastructure of free energy had to be destroyed first. This is the true reason for the fire at the Crystal Palace. This is why the magnificent pavilions in America were demolished and burned. It was not simply the removal of temporary buildings. It was a war against the technologies of freedom. They deliberately drove us into a technological dead end based on consumption and planetary destruction, hiding from us the key to a harmonious existence. Nikola Tesla was not an inventor in the way we understand the term. He was, more accurately, a brilliant restorer. He found access to the surviving fragments of knowledge from that era and tried to revive them, to return to humanity its inheritance. His Wardenclyffe Tower was an attempt to recreate one of the elements of that ancient energy grid, and he was immediately stopped and destroyed by the financial elites, like the banker J.P. Morgan, whose fortune and power were built on selling copper for wires and investing in the coal and oil industries. Free energy was a death sentence to them. They didn't just take our energy, they took our past. To create their new reality, they needed new people. But where would they find them in a world devastated by catastrophe? The new reality, based on scarcity and control, required not only the destruction of old technologies, but also the creation of a new society. A society devoid of memory of its past. And here we come to the most chilling and disturbing part of this investigation, which concerns not metal and energy, but humanity itself. If you carefully study photographs from the second half of the 19th century, you will notice a strange, unsettling anomaly. The cities in these images, St. Petersburg, Paris, Washington, London, appear deserted. We see magnificent buildings, wide avenues, complex infrastructure, but there are practically no people on the streets. Official science explains this as a technical imperfection of early photography. Supposedly, due to long exposure times that could last several minutes, moving objects, people, carts, simply didn't register on the photographic plate, leaving behind only emptiness. But this explanation doesn't hold up to scrutiny. Even with a long exposure, moving objects should have left behind blurry shadows, smeared silhouettes, trails of motion on the cobblestones. But what we see are crystal clear, dead streets. Perfect cobblestones without the slightest trace of activity. It gives the distinct impression that the photographer was capturing not a bustling metropolis, but a giant ghost town. Against the backdrop of this visual emptiness, the official demographic statistics of the period look even stranger. They speak of an explosive population growth, of millions of people storming factories and filling the cities. But mathematics is a stubborn thing. To build and then maintain all the infrastructure we see, millions of skilled workers, engineers, and craftsmen were needed. Where did they come from in a world that, by all appearances, had just experienced a catastrophe that left behind empty cities? This demographic paradox becomes even more sinister when we recall two social phenomena of that era that historians carefully avoid. The first is the so-called orphan trains in the United States. From the mid-19th to the early 20th century, special trains ran from major East Coast cities into the country's interior, transporting hundreds of thousands of children. These children, whose origins were unknown, were simply given away to farmers and settlers as a labor force. Where did these millions of parentless children come from? Where did their parents disappear to in such numbers that it required a nationwide program for their distribution? The second phenomenon is the strange prevalence of child labor in Europe. Child chimney sweeps, child miners. These were not just isolated episodes of hardship, but a mass phenomenon, indicating a catastrophic shortage of an adult workforce. A picture emerges of a world after a global cataclysm that wiped out a large portion of the adult population, leaving behind millions of orphans and empty cities built by a previous civilization. And it is here, at the intersection of these facts, that the most incredible and shocking hypothesis is born. The new masters of the world, who seized power after the Great Reset, faced a shortage of human resources for their new economic model. And so, they launched a program of artificial repopulation. And the evidence for this was displayed openly, at the very same World's Fairs. Next to the pavilions showcasing wonders of technology, there were equally popular pavilions featuring infant incubators. We are told these were charitable efforts to save premature babies. But the scale of this phenomenon is staggering. These were veritable human hatcheries, pavilions filled with rows of incubators containing thousands of infants without parents. These children were displayed to the public as another attraction, another achievement of progress. Later, once grown, they ended up in orphanages, and from there onto the orphan trains or into factories. All the links in the chain form a single, monstrous picture. The empty cities left behind by the previous civilization were repopulated, with new people, artificially grown, deprived of parents, history, and memory. We were raised anew, given primitive technologies and a false history. And today, we live among the legacy of giants, without understanding what it is. We were raised anew, given primitive technologies and a false history. And today, we live among the legacy of giants, without understanding what it is. We are a planetary-scale cargo cult. Like the tribes who built straw airplanes hoping to bring back gifts from the sky, we walk on bridges whose working principles are forgotten, and live in houses we cannot build with the same durability and elegance. We found the cities, machines, and tools left for us, and reduced their purpose to the simplest functions we could understand, or turned them into objects of worship, cultural monuments. We are living on a grand stage set, not built by us. Our entire history of the last 200 years is an elaborate script written to explain to us where this set came from. We were told a fairy tale about a heroic industrial revolution, about lone geniuses who invented steam engines and built iron palaces by candlelight. But in reality, it was not a story of invention, but a story of rediscovery and appropriation. A story of how our ancestors, survivors or newly created, dug up, cleaned off, and restarted the infrastructure of a previous civilization, but in a primitive, stripped-down form. Now, let's return to the Eiffel Tower, where our investigation began. Look at it again, but with new eyes. It is not the symbol of Paris, nor a triumph of 19th century engineering. It is a tombstone. A tombstone on the grave of a great civilization whose technology we couldn't even comprehend, let alone replicate. It is a monument to the greatest act of sabotage in history, when humanity was diverted from a path of harmony and free energy onto a path of slavish resource consumption. It is a deactivated generator of free life energy, which, in our ignorance, we use as an observation deck and a backdrop for tourist selfies. We worship these iron skeletons, never suspecting they are powerless machines. Every old train station with its intricate metal vaults, every riveted bridge across a river, every cast iron fence in an old park. This is not just architecture. These are fragments of a former greatness. They are silent witnesses to the great lie upon which our society is built. They stand among our concrete boxes as a reproach, a reminder that we are living on ruins, proudly calling it progress. We admire the form, having completely forgotten the function, and we call art what was once advanced technology. The fires of Moscow and Washington, the great fires in American cities, the world's fairs burning down one after another. These were not accidents, but stages in a war of erasure. The old world, with its harmony of metal and stone, with its etheric energy, was purposefully destroyed. And upon its rubble, our world was built. A world of soot, oil, debt, and lies, where we are forced to pay for what was once as free as the air we breathe. So, the next time you pass an old bridge or a grand train station, ask yourself, is this a monument to our progress or a fragment of a greatness we have lost? And the most important question, if we ever remember how it all works, will they let us flip the switch again?